Welcome, everyone, to today's virtual event brought to you by Barbara's Bookstore, the oldest independent bookstore in the Chicago area, going strong since 1963. Today, we are proud to present Franklin Rock by author Dr. Mark E. Klein, moderated this evening by Jeffrey A. Wolin. Jeffrey A. Wolin is the Ruth N. Halls Professor Emeritus of Photography at Indiana University. All right, gentlemen, go ahead.
Hi.
Okay, well, thanks, Laura. Thanks to Barbara's Bookstore, which is a wonderful independent bookstore right here in Chicago. You can purchase a copy of Mark's novel, Franklin Rock. You can do that online, and you just hit the green button on your screen. You can see that little green button, and you get 10% off when you order the book. Use the code EVENT. Free shipping on orders of $25 or more. And listen, we all need to support independent businesses, and we need to support artists and writers as well. If you have any questions, there's a little place on the bottom that says ask a question, and we'll get to whatever questions we can throughout the conversation or at the end. So without that, any further ado, I'd just like to say this is going to be a lot of fun. Mark Klein and I go back over half a century, which is scary to think about.
He's a lot older.
We grew up around the corner from each other. Yeah, I'm a lot older. I'm what, a month, 5 months. Anyway, we grew up around the corner from each other and played with each other as kids and grew up together, lost touch with each other and reconnected not that long ago, and started sharing our lives with each other. And when Mark's book was published, he sent me a copy, and I've read it, and it's delightful and provocative. And Mark, you want to say anything before we jump in and have our conversation?
Well, this is a lot of fun on a lot of levels, because as Jeff mentioned, we rediscovered each other after many years, and neither one of us can remember why we lost touch, but that's what happens. But one of the things we're going to talk about a lot tonight is time, and it's fascinating. And you know, I can still see myself in Jeff's house. In fact, I actually see myself in your house more than I see you in my house. I'm not exactly sure why that is. Maybe we spend more time in your house. But so that's, to me, this is another added benefit, to get some time to spend with Jeff and really renew our friendship. That was, you know, quite important to, certainly to me, and I'm sure to him, I hope to him, when we were younger. So we're gonna have a lot of fun tonight.
Well, let's just jump in. When you think about this book, Mark, when you were writing it and now that it's completed, do you think of it as science fiction, fantasy, philosophy? Not that we have to pigeonhole everything, but what were you thinking about, and what do you think about now as we have this conversation?
Well, you know, I never thought about that question when I was writing the book. You know, as some people may know, there's some time travel in this book. That's why Jeff asked me, you know, why you mentioned science fiction. So people think time travel, science fiction, and I get that. But in this book, I wouldn't call it a time travel book. Time travel is a vehicle. It's a vehicle for Franklin, who is the protagonist of the book, and for whom the book is named. And Franklin does have this ability to time travel, but he doesn't do it in the sense of a lot of characters we're familiar with in many books over the years, what we would call science fiction books. Time travel for Franklin is a vehicle to learn, to explore, and really bring out some of the major themes in the book, which I'm sure we're going to get to. So I would say this book is, like I said, I didn't have an idea in my head to say I want to write a science fiction book or a philosophy book, or I guess there is some philosophy in it for sure. There are some great characters who really spew a fair amount of, I think, really good philosophy, and we'll get to them also. And it's some people would say it might be metaphysical in some sense, because there is some of that. But when I set out to write this book, you know, Franklin kind of milled around in my head for quite a while. This is not something I thought of, you know, 6 months ago and boom, sat down and write it. Franklin was created in my mind 7 or 8 years ago. And what I really was set out to do was to explore some major themes like time and, you know, life, why we're here, things like that. And so I needed to create a vehicle to do that. And that's what Franklin really became. So the end result is a little composite of a lot of the things you mentioned. The first thing I want to do is make sure it was fun, because I'm sure you feel the same way, that nobody likes reading a book that is tedious. We want our books to move. None of us have a ton of time. We're looking to read to escape or to learn something new. And the last thing you want to do is, dread picking that book up. And that was the number one thing I wanted to avoid. I think I did it. Well, the readers can determine that.
So who's Franklin? Are you Franklin, or is Franklin a composite of people you've met?
Right. So
something you invented out of whole cloth?
There's, I think in the first chapter, there's a prologue to the book, and in the first chapter, I think the very first sentence that Franklin utters is, everything one writes is autobiographical. Maybe it's something about, I'm going to paraphrase, I don't have the book in front of me. Maybe it's about maybe it's true. Maybe it's something you wished were true. Maybe something was hoped was true. Maybe it's something you were afraid was true. But in a sense, everything, I think that's very true. All of us, when we write, have to pull out of something. I mean, there is a lot of out of thin air, as you suggested in this book, and there is in every novel, but it's got to come from somewhere. It has to come from an experience or somebody you've met or something in your own life. So who's Franklin Rock? Franklin has a lot of traits I wish I had, right? When you get to invent a character, you get to make yourself, you get to create something that's better than yourself, which wasn't that hard to do in my case. So Franklin starts off in college, and he has this epiphany and he's not sure what it means, but he suddenly realizes that his life is going to be something extraordinary. He doesn't know why, he doesn't know how, but he just gets this feeling that something extraordinary is going to happen in his life. And he's literally thrilled by it, but confused. And so the first part of the book, Franklin has to find out what's going to happen to him, what is this epiphany really about, and who he is, and to come to grips with the fact that he's more than he seems, and he has been chosen. One of the themes in the book, I think, for Franklin is that he is chosen. So what does that mean? So chosenness, some people would say, well, what, you get a crown on your head, you're chosen to be the prince, you get to win a lottery, whatever. But that's not how I look at chosenness. To me, chosenness is a responsibility. And Franklin is tagged with this responsibility. And not to give away too much of the book, but Franklin learns that he has a mission. And his mission, he discovers, is to fix the world. So it's no small little task he's about to undertake. And the first part of the book talks about how Franklin becomes, what I like to say is becoming Franklin Rock. How does he become the character who's going to be able to, or at least attempt to complete this incredibly challenging mission? And then the rest of the book goes on, and once Franklin realizes who he is, and then he meets a lot of people, has some really interesting experiences, and heads down the road as any good hero would do.
He's guided by his friendships at first, and his mentor. He seeks out and becomes mentored by a series of remarkable individuals, including some, Martin Luther King and Einstein, and let's see,
Carl Jung.
Oh, Carl Jung. So
Yeah.
each one of them helps him develop another, continue the path a little further on his quest. And so that must have been a lot of fun, thinking of a conversation with any of those remarkable individuals.
So you mentioned he has a mentor. We'll get to his mentor in a minute, but I'll just keep on the theme you just brought up. Franklin meets a few of these people from history. And writing those chapters, I have to say, was just what you said. It was just so much fun. I mean, obviously had to do some research. This is fiction, so the research didn't have to be that exacting. We weren't going to bring the real characters in terms of their historical place necessarily, but it was really the interaction Franklin had with them that's really the important part, and that was a lot of fun. And I think that people ask me what's my favorite chapter in the book. There's 45 chapters in the book. Don't be afraid; they're short chapters. Right? This is not War and Peace. But I think my favorite chapter was actually writing about Martin Luther King Jr. And the book actually came out a few days before Martin Luther King Day. So, but those were a lot. They were a lot of fun to write. I learned a lot, and I think anybody who's written something. I've written 2 other books. They're nonfiction. That's a whole different animal. In nonfiction, you have to tell the truth. Well, you're supposed to tell the truth. I guess some people don't when they write nonfiction, but the goal is to tell the truth, obviously. The fiction gives you a lot more latitude. And I'd written short stories, but I'd never written a full-blown novel before. And I found the process to be just fascinating. It was difficult at times, of course, but it was the exploration and the feeling of freedom to really go anywhere you wanted to go. I didn't know how these chapters I didn't know how one single chapter was going to end when I started it. So it was a blast. I mean, it was a discovery for me. I had a ton of fun. And then, of course, once you finish that, you have to go back and realize that a chapter in the beginning of the book when you didn't know where you were going and the chapter at the end of the book don't really mesh. So you have to clean up that mess. But that's also fun. So I thought the whole process was just really, for me, I always said if nobody bought this book, I'd still be happy. That's kind of not true. I actually do want people to buy the book, but the process itself was very rewarding.
Yeah, I mean, you don't write a book to put it in the closet. You want there to be an audience. You want people to interact with it and to give you feedback. It's like artists don't make work without the idea of showing it. It would be empty, it would be devoid of pleasure if you just worked and worked in a closet and never got your ideas, your books, your photographs, whatever it was, out into the world for it to participate in humanity.
I completely agree with you. I know you've actually, if people look over my shoulder, they'll see some of Jeff's books. There's one called Telling Stories, and there's one, I think, Pigeon Hills on the other side. If you're not familiar with Jeff Wallen's work, he's exhibited in many museums around the country. His work has been recognized as just phenomenal by so many people who are way more sophisticated about art and photography than I am. But I know we're here to talk about my book, but you should look at Jeff's work. It's actually fantastic, and I think you'll find it very moving and interesting. So I agree with you. It's fun for me to talk to somebody besides that we're friends, who is so well versed in the arts and has spent his career using his talents to bring these messages to people. So, which is interesting because that's really why I wrote Franklin Rock. I'm not at the age where, I'm going to have a 50-year career writing books, although I've gotten a good start. So hopefully we'll continue to do so. But to me, the reason I wrote this book is because I call it my Save the World book. So what does that mean? I've been a physician for over 40 years. I've been taking care of patients, and I like to say that I've probably seen, when I calculate, over 100,000 patients. So maybe 100,000 visits with patients, because some of them were repeats, thank God. But I've seen a ton of people, and I've been very blessed to have that. And when you're a physician, you kind of get addicted to helping people. I mean, if you don't get addicted to that, then I think you miss the whole point of the profession. So I think most doctors, not only do they care, but they are addicted to this interaction with patients. Patients think you come into a room and the flow of information is just one way. You ask a question, the doctor gives you the answer, and that's so it's almost, in a sense, for the patient, an asymmetric relationship. But I think for doctors, at least for me, I'll talk for myself, I'm getting a lot out of this at the same time. I love talking to patients. Obviously, the goal is to help the patient either solve a problem, identify a problem, come up with an explanation for something, or sometimes it's just to listen and to be at ear. And to me, that's been by far and away the best part of my job, just to listen to patients, and just that active listening and caring is just very effective. So translating that to becoming writing a novel like this, the idea was to expand that desire that I have. I'm not kidding. It's an obsession, an addiction, whatever you want to call it. I just have this need, almost like Franklin does, to make a difference, to help people, to make the world a better place, to move the needle towards a better better country, a better world. Certainly now it's like timing couldn't be better, right? But I will admit that freely. I might not have admitted that, 10, 20 years ago, but you get to a certain age and you go, I don't really care if they think I'm going to tell you the truth. And that's how I feel. So I wrote this book to try and expand my ability to just make things better, make people feel better. This is an extremely optimistic book. Jeff, you read it. I think it's hard to finish this book and not feel some positivity at the end of it. Would you say that's a fair statement?
I would, and it's particularly timely because we've been in this lockdown for almost a year, and people are depressed and they can't go anywhere and they can't see family. And to think about, moving back in time, I think memory and, thinking about childhood, thinking about, recent past, distant past, thinking about a future, that is a kind of time travel. And it's maybe one of the ways that a coping mechanism for, I know you didn't write it for the pandemic, but as it happens, it's quite timely. Yes,
I looked on my calendar one day and said, write story, optimism for pandemic, right? So let's talk about time. Can we talk about time? Is that okay with you? I love talking about time. Anybody who knows me is sick of me talking about time, especially my kids. But time, when I started studying, of all things, Einstein, relativity, people go, oh God, are we going to talk about Einstein? Well, just a little bit. Because once you understand, and probably I'm sure there are people listening who know a lot more about relativity than I do, but once you understand how time works, it's fascinating. So I'll give you my latest, greatest analogy. Jeff will indulge me because he's heard this already. But most people, when they think of time, think of a timeline. So they'll look at the past is over on the left and, starting in the dawn of man and, Mesopotamia, the Roman Empire, we keep moving on. You get to the 19th century and Darwin and the 20th century and unfortunately all the wars. And all of a sudden, here we are now, and the light is shining on this particular moment, January 27, 2021. And then we assume everything to the left in that period we just talked about is grayed out. It's the past. It's something you can't get to. It's gone. And then we think of anything to the right of this point, like a blank sheet of paper. We call that the future. I think it's fair to say most people think of time that way, but it's completely incorrect. A way better way to think of time, and actually not the way better, a correct way to look at time, is my current analogy is to think of a jukebox. So imagine a giant jukebox, and the first moment of time is the first record, and it's all way to the left, and all the records are going to be in the order in which they were composed, which they were created. So the first record comes out, and we play that record, and it goes, and what happens to it? The record goes back into its slot, right? We all know that. It doesn't crumble, it doesn't disintegrate, it doesn't disappear, it doesn't vanish. It just goes right back where it was and stays there. And as we play each record in sequence, the exact same thing happens. It comes out, we play it, we can call that moment now. Each one has its moment of now, and then it goes back in. And that's how time is. But it's all of time. It's not just the past. It's the future. Every moment of time, in that sense, has occurred, exists. It has its slot in the jukebox. So Einstein would have famously said in a letter to one of his friend's mother after his friend passed away, he wrote, for we believing physicists, the past, present, and future is just an illusion. Meaning that he knew that all of time existed contemporaneously in that sense. Every moment exists. So what does that mean? Why is that important? Why am I wasting everybody's time and probably boring them to death at the moment? Because that's what I do? No, it's because it's a very important message here, especially in a time of a pandemic. So many lives have been lost, 500,000 or 400,000 plus in the United States, a couple of million worldwide. Even if you haven't lost somebody, you generally know if somebody's been lost, or we all certainly can feel other people's loss. We're empathetic. So there's been a lot of loss. And of course, as I also have been telling people, the rest of the diseases in the world haven't taken a vacation. It's not like heart disease said, you know what, let's leave the stage to the pandemic. You can kill 500,000 people this year. I'm not going to do anymore. No, all those other things that have been taking people's lives continue to do so. Heart disease, cancer, blah, 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 blah. So there's a lot of loss going on. So when we lose somebody, it's devastating until you realize this particular fact, that because all moments exist contemporaneously, and you and I, Jeff, should be able to relate to this. You and I are still actually playing at your house when we were in 8th grade. We are there right now. We can't see it, of course, but it doesn't mean it's not happening. It is happening just as in its spot in that jukebox, just as much as this moment between you and me is happening now. It's not just a memory. That moment goes on forever in its sight, in its space and in time. So in that sense, we never really lose anybody. Think about that. What I'm telling you now is not fiction. It's not made up. It's not even my idea, although I wish it had been. I'd be really famous, but it's not. It's Einstein, and anybody who's versed, any physicist would tell you, that's how it is. In fact, if you want to go to Barbara's bookstore and buy a good book, buy a book by Brian Greene. He's a physicist at Columbia University. He's a great writer. One of the books that actually started me on this was something called The Fabric of the Cosmos. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in this. It's not that hard to read, but you'll get a lot out of it. Click on a Brian Greene book. But there are lots of physicists who will tell you the same thing in lay language. So that's, to me, extremely comforting. Wow. You mean you're still with your parents. You're still with your dogs that you lost. I lost a dog while I was writing Franklin Rock. My dog of 12 years passed away. Well, you'll find him in the third part of the book, because when he passed away, I was just starting to write that last part, and I put him in the book. So he's there in perpetuity, which makes me feel great. But even now, when I walk into my family room, I look where he would lay down and rest, and he's still there. Not at this particular minute, but he's there in all those minutes of his life that he was alive. Those moments never go away. So when you understand how time works, it creates this incredible comfort that nobody's ever really gone. And maybe it only works for me, but I think if people think about this, if they let it run through their head, they'll find an incredible source of joy and optimism. The fact that nobody is ever really gone. It's fact. It's true. And for me, at least, I find it extremely comforting. And there's a lot of that in Franklin Rock.
So the book, you're talking a lot in scientific terms, which is the underpinnings of your approach to this book. But there's also a very strong spiritual quality to the book, to this notion of time, which has a Zen, quality as well. And I wonder, what do you think about how would you personally, but how does science reconcile itself with spirituality, with the unknown, with, things we can't see or really know scientifically, the ultimate reality? How do you reconcile science, spirituality, the known and the unknown, the unknowable?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I'm a science guy, right? I studied, biology and chemistry and physics and calculus, and it was all science. I did take some literature classes. In fact, Franklin's mentor, Professor Niemeyer, is loosely based on a professor I had who taught me German literature in college. So, but as a science person, we're very skeptical, right? We don't believe any of this, mumbo jumbo, right? You gotta prove it. You gotta show me the facts, show me the science, show me the detail. Well, over time, I like to say I kept getting whacked in the head by things that didn't seem to make much sense. And I'll give you an example. So as I thought about, and this is actually from my last book, why is it that we're so dumb when we're young and we're so smart at the end? When you think about that, let's just assume that the world could be any way, that the laws of physics and the way the world works and all the things we're used to don't actually have to be that way. It could be different. We'll get to that later, but it could be different. So it does seem peculiar to me that, when for instance, when safety is most important, when you're young, you got your whole life ahead of you. Let's say you're going to live to 90. So when you're 18, you got 72 years to go. So why is it that you do really stupid things like drive at 100 miles an hour, or maybe take drugs you don't even know what they are, or all kinds of ways endanger yourself? That doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Because that's the riskiest time of your life. You have the most to gain, right? Why would you take the highest risk? Whereas now, when you get to, you're in your 80s, let's say, it really doesn't matter what you do. You might as well drive 100 miles an hour because you only got probably a few years left anyway. Maybe if you're lucky, 15. But relatively speaking, compared to the 18-year-old, you're in the ninth inning, right? So that seemed peculiar to me. When you stop and think about it, there's a lot of things in life that are peculiar. I call, in fact, there's a chapter in the book called Peculiar, where Franklin and one of his friends talk about some of these exact topics. But, we take these things for granted. Well, that's just the way the world is. Yeah, but that's not the way. There are other possibilities. The world could be different. Why are we like that? And there's a whole bunch of those things that come up when you actually start to examine the way the world works. It's quite peculiar. Here's another one. So we pretty much went through the exact same growth and emotions as our parents, and the same as their parents, and generation after generation goes through the same trials and tribulations. Being embarrassed and ashamed, and not knowing things you should know, and just slowly progressing as you get to be an adult. And like I said, you just keep going and keep learning till the end, right? Well, why don't we, if the same thing happens to every generation, why do we actually have to go through it? Why does each of us have to go through that? Well, you would say it's just the way it is, right? But again, it doesn't have to be this way. How come you don't get a little manual when you're like 4 and you read the manual and it tells you everything about life and you go, okay, I'm good, right? No, it doesn't work that way. You have to experience these things yourself. People can tell you about, don't do this because this is what's going to happen, and you do it anyway, and you go, crap, why didn't I listen? Because you can't. You have to do it yourself. That's peculiar. So there are a lot of things. This is all. So when I think about the things, I go, boy, this world's kind of a wacky, crazy place. So that's where the spiritual element comes in. You then required as a scientist to face facts and say, look, we can't explain all of this. Consciousness, what the heck is consciousness? Nobody knows. Go to the Mayo Clinic, go to Mass General, you can go anywhere you want and ask the smartest people in the world what consciousness is, and they'll go, I don't know. I have no idea, right? So there are a lot of things about the world that we just can't explain. So people would say, well, because our science is not evolved enough. Maybe, but I have been convinced that there's another layer. So it doesn't have to be religion. You don't have to believe in God. You don't have to believe in any particular religion. What I like to say is, I have no idea what's going on, but I know there's something else. Because all the facts of the world, including the physics we just talked about, and we won't get into quantum physics, that's a whole crazy thing. You'll get that in some of those books I mentioned. But the world's a crazy place. I mean, when you start to understand how the world works, it is bizarre. And we don't have a shred of an idea what's going on. So that part, then you're moving from the science to this, what you would call the spiritual. And I'd like to say, well, you can call it spiritual or metaphysical, but to me, it's just like there's something else. And there's a lot of that, as you mentioned, in Franklin Rock. There's just something else. And he explores that, as all of us need to explore this in our own lives.
So I was thinking, about this issue of spiritual and a spiritual life and a spiritual quest. And of course, there's this quest for self-discovery. And there's so much literature. It's a rich tradition of the quest. It begins with the Epic of Gilgamesh, Homer's Odyssey, the Arthurian legends, Huckleberry Finn, and Gurdjieff's Meetings with Remarkable Men, Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, which you quote in your book, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. Let's just go there and talk about the idea of the spiritual quest and what authors maybe have influenced you. And of course, we'll have to have a nice conversation about good old Kurt.
We're going to get to Kurt. So Jeff sent me some of these questions the other day and said, what do you think about these questions? And I told Jeff, ask me anything you want. If I don't know, I'll just tell you I don't know, or we'll make something up. We'll have some fun. But when I saw this particular question, my first thought was the thought I have when I give lectures to other doctors. So in my career, I've had different areas of interest and different specialties, and I've taught a fair amount. And rule number one to me was always, don't give a lecture to a group of people that know more than you about the topic, right? And I once did that. It was a big mistake. But I read this question on, uh-oh, here we go again. Jeff is way smarter than I am. He knows a lot more about this. This may not turn out so good. But I figured I'd give it a shot because we discovered during our conversations recently that, well, we both loved Kurt Vonnegut. So if I had to pick one author at a time in my life when I was the most susceptible, or I think that's a fair term, susceptible to new ideas and new ways of thinking, it was Kurt Vonnegut. And I read all his books when I was in college or soon after college. And then I reread them, some of them, about a year ago, 2 years ago, very recently. And of course, then Jeff and I rediscover each other, and boom, first of all, Vonnegut was in Indiana, but besides that, we both discovered that we were really enamored of him as an author. And he talks about some of these issues. And in fact, I think I shared with you, Jeff, when I went back and I had read multiple books, but then I hadn't read Slaughterhouse-Five again. And the reason is because I really don't like violence. I think violence is really such a weight on this world. And there's a lot of that, some of that in Franklin Rock also. And I remember reading Slaughterhouse-Five and then seeing the movie, and remembering, the violence, especially in the movie. And so I didn't want to read that book again. But Jeff and I talked, and he mentioned it. And I went, you know what? I'm going to read Slaughterhouse-Five again. So I did about a month ago. And I'm reading this book, and all of a sudden I come across a passage where he talks about time. And it's exactly what I just described to you about how time works. And when I read this as a teenager or a young adult, I didn't have any idea what time was about. And so I just read those words, and it probably went right over my head. I'm sure they went right over my head. But now when I read them, I'm going, holy mackerel, Kurt Vonnegut knew this. He knew this truth about time. How cool is this? And then as I read his books again, I just interpreted them through a different filter completely. Not only did I think his books were so fun to read and just flowed beautifully, and I would read them like probably you did, just like in one or two sittings. I mean, you don't really want to stop. At least I didn't. But he had this grasp of time, and that's what, and the way the world works, that's what his whole shtick about Tralfamadore is about, right? How the world is. We laughed, Jeff and I laughed about, if you haven't read Sirens of Titan, I won't ruin it for you, but I mean, when you get to the end, you have to start laughing because he explains the universe in a very interesting way. So when I read this, I was like, holy mackerel, I loved it, but I didn't appreciate it at the way I can appreciate it now. So he had a really big impact on me. Gilgamesh, not so much, right?
Well, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time is the beginning of Slaughterhouse-Five. And this whole idea of time travel, there's a really beautiful passage it's my favorite passage in like all of literature, where Billy Pilgrim is waiting. He knows he's good because he's lived in every moment in the past, present, and future. He knows he's about to be abducted by the Tralfamadorians. He's going to be lifted up into their flying saucer and taken to the planet. And he decides he's waiting. They're not there yet. He knows they're going to come in an hour or whatever. So he starts watching a World War II movie. And in this movie, the squadron of bombers takes off from an Air Force base in England, and it flies over Germany and drops. It drops bombs. German fighter planes come over and shoot at them, and some of them are, shot down, and some of them return to base. And then he decides, well, I'll watch it backwards. So he watches that film backwards, and it begins with the planes crashing, but they magically are lifted back into the air, and the bullets that knock them out of the sky are magically sucked out of their aircraft, and they land peacefully and safely back at their base in London. And then the bombs are shipped back to the US and are carefully, the explosives are carefully removed and then buried in the earth from whence they came.
Yeah,
and it's just such a beautiful.
So we haven't talked about this, you and I, but I when I read it again a month ago, I felt when I read that passage, I went, oh my God, right? He's taken this horrendous, horrible, violent, destructive scene, and by running it backwards, gives you a view of this. He turns it into this beautiful passage, but the whole idea of what man has just wrought, it just strikes you, doesn't it? It just strikes you. I felt the exact same way about that. I love that passage. But you mentioned something earlier about Billy Pilgrim is unstuck in time. That's Kurt's statement in Slaughterhouse-Five. Well, I can tell you that I have become unstuck in time. by reading and thinking and actually writing Franklin Rock, I have become unstuck. Mark Klein has become unstuck in time. Maybe I should write that. But what does that mean? It means that I can see, I can feel. Jeff and I at his house. I can see. I think some of our old friends from high school might be watching also, because I think we might have coerced them into doing it. But I can see me with them. Not today. Not looking as we do, unfortunately, in this. Most of us should have our. I feel like I should have all the mirrors removed from my house. It's just too depressing. But I can see us and feel us back playing together, or being in school together, being in the school play together. And I think that is possible for everybody. And I would really urge people, if when you read this book, I hope you get unstuck in time. It is a gift beyond imagination. I am not making this up. To be unstuck in time is to appreciate what life is, to become the observer. So we don't want to only be observers. We want to live life. We want to love. We want to have relationships. We want to experience things. We want to feel the dirt in your hands when you're in the garden. You want to feel the wind in your hair actually, if I had hair, I'd feel the wind in my hair. But some people feel wind in their hair, I'm sure. I'm just not one of them. But being on a sailboat, all the things, skiing down a mountain, all those great feelings that we have, with the thrill you get when you go see the Rocky Mountains or the Swiss Alps for the first time, right? Those are great, and you need that. But you also need to be the observer, to look and say and understand what's happening in this world. And the reason is because A, you'll appreciate it much more, and B, you won't get sucked into this void, into this vortex of sorrow and sadness and depression. I like to tell people, this is going to sound crazy, and I talk to patients about this all the time, don't take all of this too seriously. We all know the end of the movie. Everybody's movie ends exactly the same way, right? We're all going to die. 100% mortality is still 100% among humans. So there's got to be a different point to life, because you can't get it all right and get to go again. It's like the old kind of pinball games that I played in college, where if you scored enough points, you get a free game. You don't get a free game. You get one game, right? And we all know how it ends. Just the time, the place, and the situation, right? That's what we don't know. That's the only thing we don't know. When I was in camp as a kid, they'd have this thing called color war. And we all knew color war was going to occur in the last week of camp. But the only thing we didn't know was how they're going to break color war. Was it going to be some event? It would be balloons or whatever. And we didn't know which team we were going to be on. There were some things we didn't know. We all knew there was going to be color war. Well, that's kind of how I look at life. We all know what the ending is. We don't know exactly how they're going to break it to us, right? We're not sure. We're going to pass in our sleep, or which would be great, very lucky, or something else going to happen. And we don't know the time, the place, and the situation. But we know the ending. It's not a surprise. So there's got to be another story. Longevity is not the point of life. That is for certain. And once you realize that, then you can step back a little bit and go, okay, if it doesn't really matter how long I live, what am I supposed to get out of this? What am I supposed to get out of this life? And there's a great character in the book. And anybody who's written something like this will appreciate this. I created this character out of whole cloth, as you said earlier. His name is Maurice Burnside. Maurice Burnside, I have personally fallen in love with Maurice Burnside. And I think most people who read this book will have a similar experience. Maurice Burnside is an 80-something-year-old black guy who shows up in the hospital when Franklin's there. And I won't tell you about how they get the relationship, and what happens is, I think, pretty interesting and pretty fun and very cool. So I won't go into that because I don't want to spoil it. But it's enough to say that Maurice teaches Franklin a lot about life. He becomes a secondary mentor in effect. And these are two people from completely different worlds, right? And yet they've been thrown together and literally create this incredible bond over a relatively short time. Now, I think that's happened to most of us, right? And hopefully it's happened to most of us. You find somebody and bang, it just meld, and something happens. Maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a mentor, maybe it's a teacher, maybe it's somebody you fall in love with. It could be a lot of different things. But it happens, and that is just magic. And when you're in the middle of it, if you're enough of an observer, while you're experiencing it, you get to appreciate, wow, this is something. And so this is what happens with Maurice and Franklin, and he teaches them some very, very important lessons in life. And one of them, which I think is another thing I hope people get out of this book. Let me just say one thing about the book. I had this terrible analogy. I'm going to give it to you anyway. It's a terrible analogy. But the analogy is Franklin Rock is kind of like ice cream with vegetables in it. The reason it's a terrible analogy is because who would want to eat ice cream with vegetables in it? So it's like chasing people away from my book. But the point is that I think it's a really sweet, good story with a lot of good stuff in there. Stuff that I don't mean to be patronizing, say, I'm going to teach you this, but there are things most of us have learned or maybe forgotten or maybe haven't paid enough attention to. And so one of the messages, besides the time we talked about, and I think, and the fact that you never lose anybody, and that there's another layer to life. Another one is what Maurice tells Franklin at one point. He says, you know, Franklin, he goes, I'm going to teach you a trick. And the trick is this. He said, it's a very important trick that a lot of people never learn, but it's the coolest trick in life. And that is, if you place other people's troubles ahead of your own, and you focus on their issues and not your own, the burden of your own life instantly lifts. And he said, it's a magic trick. And I can tell you, for me personally, and again, I don't mean to proselytize because many people, I'm sure, have the same experience, but it's worth thinking about that when you do that, when you think that way, it is amazing how it transforms your life, how it lightens your life. I was joking with some people the other day. I said, they said, can you give us an example? I went, okay, here's an example. It's not a great example, but we'll go with it. And the example was a group of friends are sitting around a table, and there's this delicious chocolate cake in the middle. Best homemade chocolate cake ever, and everybody loves chocolate. So they divvy up the cake, everybody gets a piece, and everybody goes crazy. This is the best cake. And there's one slice of cake left. And everybody's kind of looking at each other and looking at the cake and thinking in their heads, how do I get that piece of cake? Because I really want that cake. It's so good. It's like the best thing I've ever eaten. You know, now you got to figure out, all of a sudden the stress starts. How am I going to get that cake? You know, I don't want to look like a jerk. You know, I don't want to be Donald Trump, or I want to be a nice guy, but I really want the cake, right? So now you're being very Machiavellian. What can I do? That's a lot of stress. When the truth is, the Maurice Burnside message is, give the cake to somebody else. Just give it away. You will feel 1,000 times better. Now, this is not a new thought. I didn't create this, obviously. But it's the kind of thing that is so, just like the idea that you never lose anybody, it's so comforting. It's so liberating. It's liberating. Once you realize that you can do that, and that your world doesn't end, and yet you end up feeling 100 times better than you would have if you ate that cake, it's fantastic. So when Maurice tells Franklin it's a trick, you know, I wrote this, but I was somehow magically teaching myself, reminding myself at the very least. And, you know, so I practice that. I practice that now whenever I can. And certainly as a doctor, you get a chance to do it every day, but everybody gets a chance to do it, right? We can all do that. And the trick, and the amazing part about this is that it is such a trick. It's fantastic. So that's another theme that I hope people appreciate in the book, that there are ways to make your life so much, not only more rewarding, but so much lighter and so much more meaningful at the same time. I think anybody's still awake. What do you think?
and be sure and send us some questions so that Mark can answer them as we wind down our conversation. I've known you a long time, and you've always been a very positive, optimistic person. I mean, everyone has ups and downs, but you take the view of life that you just expressed, that that life is so beautiful, and you have to enjoy it and make the most of it. The Holocaust. Today is Holocaust Memorial Day. It marks the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Global climate change is an existential, problem. Our divisive political climate. We just survived, a terrible 4-year period. Why are you hopeful about humanity, having gone through this? And
I wasn't
knowing about
right. I was feeling great till you know it now. I don't know. No, honestly, none
Sorry
of those
about that.
I'll tell you why. It's a great question. And I risk losing the audience, but I'll tell you why. None of those things make any difference. Right? It sounds insane, right? It sounds insane. What do you mean none of those things make any difference? Well, if you look at history, I can guarantee you there'll be another war. 100%, I'll bet the ranch, 100% there'll be another war. Maybe we'll be gone by then, but there'll be another war. There'll be a lot more wars. There'll be another Holocaust. There'll be another genocide. We've seen there have been genocides since the Holocaust, right? It's the most It's the most infamous, but it's not the only one. Rwanda, there's plenty of them, right? The Balkans. There will be more genocides. There will be more all of this. Why? Why is that? History, people say to ignore history is to repeat it. Well, I have news for you. Good luck. It's going to get repeated 100%. Why is that? That's another peculiarity of life. Why is it we haven't learned anything? Why is it we're going to look, even if you want to take the other side, we've seen what happens. So you can talk about the issues that the left talks about, climate change, et cetera, Donald Trump. The right might talk about, why is anybody talking about socialism? Why are we talking about, the government getting more power? Well, we got lots of evidence of that. All this is going to happen again, no matter which side of the fence you're on. All this stuff will happen again. We'll have another Holocaust. We'll have more wars. We'll have all this stuff, because that's the mess. That's what happens in life. Each of us, in our own way, has to go through the same evolution. And the reason we have these things is because we place our own individual desires and needs above the groups. It's the way humans are. Once you realize you're better off giving the cake away, that goes away. So why did I write Franklin Rock? Do I really think one book is going to get everybody to start giving the cake away and we would have no more Holocausts and no more wars? No, of course not. But I do believe that if you don't try, it'll never happen. So, to me, Franklin Rock is a shot at a movement. It's a shot at getting people to wake up and say, all the things that you worry about, we don't need to worry about. We need to worry about how we behave as individuals. If you spend your life helping other people, caring about other people, giving away the piece of cake. I'm not saying you have to live like Mother Teresa. It's just fine to make a living. It's fine to live in a nice house. It's fine, as long as you're not stealing it from somebody else. It's absolutely fine. We want, if you work hard and you're creative, innovative, great. I don't begrudge Bill Gates, and I happen to like billionaires. They bring a lot of good stuff to the world. I like Amazon. I mean, I don't have a small business. I probably feel different if I did, but most of us like these things. So it's not that it's bad to do these things, but as long as you're trying hard to help as many people as you can, to give away that piece of cake as often as you can, to make sure that you as an individual are going from the ignorant dope we were as teenagers and younger, right? We were just dopes, to rising and rising and rising and getting to the point where, you get it, that we're here for each other. We're here for other people. And this pandemic, if nothing else, has shown us how much we need each other. We're lonely to beat the band, right? You want to give people a hug. You want to have dinner with people. That's the message. That's the message. We're here for each other. That's what life's about. And so don't worry so much about climate change. Worry about making that journey as an individual from the young person who, generally speaking, doesn't get it, to hopefully somebody who does. That's the point of life. That's why we have to do it individually. That's why we can't just read a book when we're 4 years old. We need to make that journey. Now, as to why we need to make it, I have my own theories, and I won't, press this on everybody right now. But that, for me, is for sure what's going on. We have to do that. And I like to believe that if enough of us become aware of that, we can collectively move the needle. We can move towards less violence and more kindness and more generosity. I don't think it's impossible. And yes, maybe I'm the eternal optimist, and people are going to be listening to this, rolling their eyes back in their head and thinking, what has he been smoking? But I actually believe that. And I think the evidence that I've seen in the world has encouraged me, not discouraged me.
So I want to kind of circle back on something and flesh it out a little bit more. It seems that the most important, maybe the most important takeaway in the book is the role, for me anyway, the role of friendships, real friendships, and lovers and so on, and long-term friendships, and the role of mentors, people ahead of you in the game, who can who get to know, and they say, "You're okay, kid," and that's all you really need, is just some encouragement at critical times in your development. And I wonder why that's such a major part of this particular book, and what your thoughts are on those issues, those kinds of relationships, friendships, mentorships.
Right. So one of the things I've learned, and look, I've gotten everything wrong. I mean, any mistake a human being could make, I've made multiple times. I mean, that's And I'm okay with that. For instance, we'll say in politics, well, so-and-so said this, they'll show a clip. 20 years ago, you said this, and now you're on the other side of the page. And I go, well, that's great. That's the whole point, right? You really want to be the same you were 20 years ago? You've learned nothing in 20 years? If a politician doesn't flip-flop, I'm not voting for her or him, right? If you don't flip-flop, you're stuck. And you want to be unstuck, right? You want to evolve. So
Billy Pilgrim.
Billy Pilgrim, but so people change their minds. Of course they change their minds. You want that. You want people to evolve and learn and change. And in terms of what you're saying about mentors, when I watch parents, if I had to tell, I have 4 kids, and I think they're all great. And I always tell them if you turn out lousy, it's my fault. If you turn out great, I don't take any credit for it. And I think that's a pretty good rule of thumb. So they turned out great, which means at least I didn't screw it up too badly. But if you have to tell your kids, you're smart, you can do anything you want, you have the ability. Parents, if you tell your kid that every single day for 15 years, your kid's gonna do well. If you tell your kid you're stupid, you can't do this, you get everything wrong, you never get anything right. Okay, that's what a mentor is. So if you're lucky enough to have parents that do that, boy, you're lucky, right? You're super lucky. If you don't, then you hope you find a substitute along the way. It doesn't have to be a parent. I know you told me previously that you had a very important mentor in your life, and it really made a big difference to you. So we find these people where we can. So if you don't have your parents, then you're going to be looking for this. You want it. You're going to search for it. And you should search for it because you need it. We need that feeling of support and confidence, because the truth is everybody's smart enough to get by in this world. Everybody is. If you put in a little effort, you can do it. You may not, be a nuclear physicist, but you can do something useful. You can be successful. You don't have to have an IQ of 150. But if you're constantly told you're a dope and you're incompetent, you can't do anything right, and then you're not, that's going to happen. That'll be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So mentors, the best mentor I think is a parent, but we don't all get blessed with genius parents and great parents, and most of us probably don't. So then you got to look for it somewhere else. And I think that's where the role of the mentor comes in. I don't know if that was your experience or not, but I think that's true for a lot of people.
So one thing I wanted to have you talk about is the role of memory and memories, and how that might relate to your time travel metaphor.
So I look at memory differently because I don't, a lot of us rely on memory. I'll give you another example. One of our closest friends, the couple we were closest with, we traveled with them forever, and super close families. Our kids are the same age. And unfortunately, the woman passed away a few months ago after a long illness. It's very easy to be devastated by that. I mean, certainly her husband's devastated, her kids are devastated. And we were very, very close. And I hope this doesn't come across the wrong way, but I wasn't devastated, because to me, it's not just I have memories of her. I have lots of photos of all of us in the national parks. We used to go to the national parks every year. I have photos that standing next to giant sequoia trees and Moraine Lake and all kinds of beautiful places. So I have plenty of, quote, memories that I can look at photos and remember. But I don't even think about that. I think about us together because I know those moments are still alive. I know we're still together at those places. I know we're still having dinner almost every Friday night together, which is what we did. So I don't get that sense of, I don't rely on the memories, because I don't actually have a great memory. I can't remember anything. One of my kids is unfortunately cursed with the same problem. But that's why I always say I only need to read one book, because I can give it to me a month later and I'll forget that I ever read it. But I don't have to rely on memories, because I know those moments are there, right? And I don't know if I know this is a very hard concept to wrap your head around, but to me, memory is a very different thing. I don't rely on it. It doesn't mean that much to me, because I know I don't have to remember. Those moments are still going on. Does that make sense?
So to me, I guess I see a stronger relationship between your notion of time travel and memories, because it's your memories that project you back in time.
Well, if you know Franklin, that's not what happened to Franklin, right? Franklin actually went back in time because he could, because those moments are there, right? So if the moments, if what I was saying was untrue, of course, and those moments were all gone and into the trash can in the past, then you couldn't go back anywhere. Where are you going to go to? There's no place to go to. But the truth is, they are there. So you can go back there. You don't need to rely on your memory. You can just say, you can mentally transport yourself. I think that's really possible.
Isn't that a memory?
It's a little different. It's nuanced. Maybe you would call it a memory, and that's certainly legitimate. But to me, it's different, right? I'm actually living it. I'm there. I feel it. I literally feel it, right? So I guess some people would call it a memory, totally legitimate, but I look at it a little differently. Maybe we're just parsing words, and maybe we're talking about the same thing.
So for Franklin, the real challenge that he had to overcome was traveling to the future.
Yeah, so
elaborate on that.
He did. Yes, he does actually get to the future, which again, since the future exists just as the present and the past exist, doesn't seem like any big trick, right? In the sense that it's possible. And there's a phrase in the book that people who read this will hear several times, which is, if you pay attention, you can see the future in the past. And that can happen. And I'll tell you, that actually does happen in real life physics. And we won't go into that, but it does happen. But it's a statement in the book where Franklin's mentor, Professor Niemeyer, tells him, Franklin, if you pay attention, you will see the future in the past. In fact, he says to him, you will see it more than I did because you're Franklin Rock. You're way more special. And Franklin does see the future in the past. And it brings together that whole idea, which is more than a metaphor, that all of time is together. We need to become the observer and escape, get unstuck in time. I'm so glad that you had me read Kurt Vonnegut, that Slaughterhouse 5 again. I am so glad, Jeff, because that struck me. It was like, wow, Billy Pilgrim is unstuck in time. Everybody should try to get unstuck in time. It is the most liberating thing you can do. It will free you from so many concerns and worries. And life really then boils down to something quite simple, right? It's really very simple. It's how you treat other people. It's how you interact. It's that relationships are the key to all of it. That's why we're here. We're here for these relationships. So you and I have a relationship. It goes back 50 years. But you're going to go, if we happen to go to a restaurant, which we haven't done for a long time, and the waiter or waitress comes over to you, and you spend 2 seconds asking that waiter or waitress about his or her life, you've created a relationship. They all count. There's no such thing as a relationship that doesn't count. They all move. They all have meaning in the world. There's one other theme I think if we got a few minutes, I don't even look to talk about, but it's about choice. Here's another message in the book. Again, a liberating, freeing, optimistic concept. We all worry about our choices. Yogi Berra once famously said, when you get to the fork in the road, take it. Everybody laughs, right? It's yogi. It's malapropism, Yogi Berra style. But actually, Yogi was onto something, because when you make a decision, when you make a choice, and I don't mean about whether you should shoot somebody or not. I mean the regular kind of choices you make. Should I go to this college or that college? Should I, take this job or that job? Should I go out with this person or that person, right? You make a choice. Imagine a choice like a little bubble. So a little bubble gets released from you. So you release a choice, you release a bubble. So what happens to that bubble? As soon as that bubble comes out of you, it is getting bombarded by the billions of other bubbles coming out of the other 7 billion people on the earth. You have no control of that bubble once it's gone. You have no way to know which choice is the best choice. It's impossible. It's not even a question worth asking. We should never ask which is the best choice. We should just say, I'll make a choice and we'll see what happens, because you have no idea. You decide to, there's a story I have in my other book about a guy who decides he wants to stop and get shaving cream before he goes home. So when he comes out of his building, instead of going to the right to the parking lot, he makes a left and he goes to buy shaving creams. But he's in a hurry. He's got an appointment at home. So he jogs down the street. He slips as he gets to the corner, knocks over an elderly woman. She breaks her hip. Her daughter lives on the other side of the country. Her daughter has to fly over to take care of her mother. Her children are left with the husband who's at work. The children decide to make dinner. They set the house on fire, just a little fire. Fireman comes, puts it out. Husband comes in, father comes in, sees the fireman, realizes they went to high school together, like you and me. And they decide to get together a week later, and they go to a restaurant. As the fireman's parking his car, he's walking down the street. He sees smoke coming out of a house. He runs across the street as any good fireman would, smashes down the door, saves a 5-year-old girl, and brings her out safely. And that 5-year-old girl grows up and develops and invents a cure for malaria that saves millions and millions of children worldwide. All because he decided to make a left out of his building and get shaving cream instead of a right and go to his car. And that is how the world works. When you release that choice, that bubble, forget about it, because it's going to get bombarded by billions of other bubbles. It's very liberating.
I think we're close to the end of our time. Anything else you want to add to our?
Anybody have any questions? I don't think so.
We got one. Thank you, fellas. Take good care. Another Art Minds, a guy we went to high school with, another optimist.
Good. We need them.
Yeah, please, if you have any questions out there, this is your chance to ask Mark.
Well,
here's another one. I'm in the middle of your book. I love it. I don't know.
Is that my sister? Is that my sister, or is it no?
Lisa? Who's Lisa? Oh, Jerry Neistat. Fascinating presentation. Thanks, guys. I enjoyed it. Somebody else we grew up with from childhood.
Yeah. So, but for me, I just want to say thank you to you. I mean, this has been just a chance to get to spend time together like this. You're such a good guy, such a smart guy, and such a talented person. It's a real pleasure for me. I'm so glad that we have reconnected. I'm glad Franklin Rock was involved in that.
Thanks, Mark. And I guess if any of you wish to listen to this again, it's there's on the right side of your screen is a link to to the conversation we had. Here's the book. You can get it from Barbara's bookstore, and just click the green thing in the bottom. And we obviously want to thank Barbara's bookstore for this opportunity to present Mark's work to a broader audience.
And I would strongly recommend people pick up some of Jeff Wallen's photography books. You will just love them. They're not just photos. He has great stories in them, and it's definitely worth doing. So I highly recommend that.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining us, and be well and be safe.